Hello, everyone. I am Tanushree Ganguly, and welcome to the first Data to Action webinar of 2026. I essentially run a program called the Air Quality Life Index. For those of you who don't know about the AQLI, as we call it, it's a global tool which is housed within the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. And what we essentially do is we allow people around the world to see how many years of life they could gain if they had access to cleaner air. The flip side of that is we also let people to see how many years of their life they're potentially losing because of the polluted air that they are breathing. The idea with all of this information is to essentially empower people with resources that they can then use to hold their governments accountable, while also driving action on air pollution. And action often is kickstarted by conversation. So this effort of ours is to build a strong and informed discourse on air pollution globally. Now, what we do as part of AQLI is that we calculate the benefits of cleaner air in terms of longer and healthier lives for people for 250 plus countries around the world. All of this analysis is then translated into an annual report that we produce every single year. And you see the link here. My colleague Rishikesh, who joined me today, has put in a link to the report in the chat box. So if you're interested in looking at the report, you can always access the report. And this year, what we did was we revamped the entire website with a bunch of really cool features. What this essentially means is that every data point that I will talk about today in my presentation, you can generate yourself. So you don't need an AQLI person to help you generate these insights. Every single insight that you will see on the screen today is something that you can generate yourself. This is just our way to democratize access to information. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second to give you some context. So as you can see on my screen right now, there are two incredible women who are going to be our guest speakers for today. We have Azjargal and Enkhuun from Breathe Mongolia. And I will let them talk about Breathe Mongolia and what Breathe Mongolia does, but just a little bit of context. We as AQLI have been around for about 8 years now. And sometime last year, we realized that while we are putting out information, we also want to try and understand how this information is catalyzing action around the world. How are people around the world meaningfully engaging with air pollution data? And in our attempt to unpack these questions, we launched the Data to Action webinar. I'm going to quickly show you some of the insights that you can actually, I'm going to give you a snapshot of some of the webinars we've done so far, and also then move, specifically to the conversation that we have scheduled for today. So as I just said, that these webinars were introduced last year to think through two specific questions, right? I think it's important for us to have these questions in our mind as we enter into this conversation. Is one, great, there is a lot of air quality information out there, but how do we really communicate it to get people to care about air pollution? Because that's the first step, right? We know that there is a morbid aspect of air pollution, but does that really get people to care? So how do we change it? And how are people like Enkhuun and Azjargal changing it in their countries? And the second question is that once this information is out to the public, how can citizens and community stakeholders and local actors use that information to catalyze action? And again, here insights from Enkhuun and Azjargal would be particularly beneficial. Over the course of the last year, we've done multiple of these webinars. We've spoken to groups from Poland, the Gambia, Pakistan, and Thailand. And of course, this year we are kickstarting with Mongolia. Now, before I sort of hand it over to Enkhuun, what I want to do is give you a little bit of context of what the problem is really in Mongolia. And like I said, all of these insights have been generated using AQLI data. It's super short. And this is sort of just in my head, a synopsis of how bad the problem is. So key takeaway number one, which is air pollution is shortening lives across Mongolia. What we are seeing is, on average, Mongolia is reducing, air pollution is reducing life expectancy in the country by 2 years. But in the most polluted region in Mongolia, which is Ulaanbaatar, used to be the most polluted capital in the world, air pollution is reducing life expectancy by about 4 years. this is a very large number. The average reduction in life expectancy globally is about 1.9 years. In some of the most polluted parts of the world, like Dhaka or Delhi, people are losing more than 6 years of their life expectancy because of air pollution. And it is in this spectrum that we are seeing that in Ulaanbaatar, people are losing more than 4 years of their life because of air pollution. So that's key takeaway number one. The key takeaway number two for me is that air pollution is the greatest external threat in Mongolia. What this means is that the number of years of lives lost to air pollution in Mongolia are higher than some of the other very well-known risks like tobacco or high alcohol consumption or unintentional injuries, traffic injuries, and so on. So as far as public health priority is concerned, air pollution is right up there in the case of Mongolia. And finally, my third sort of slide is around just understanding what pollution levels look like in the case of Ulaanbaatar, which is going to be the focus of our conversation, which is that if you look at, so you'll see on this slide, there are 3 lines. One shows how pollution levels have changed in Ulaanbaatar over time. Then we have a Mongolia National Standard, which is about 25 microgram per meter cube. This is only for particulate matter 2.5. And then the third blue line is the WHO guideline, which is sort of the benchmark or universally acknowledged benchmark for clean air. So the first thing which is very clear is that the pollution levels in Ulaanbaatar are significantly higher than not just the WHO guideline, but also the country's own national standard of 25 microgram per meter cube. If pollution levels in Ulaanbaatar were brought down to meet even the national standard, then people in Ulaanbaatar could live more than 2 years longer. So just by meeting that interim target of the national standard, life expectancy could go up by 3.5 years. And of course, if pollution levels are brought down to meet that benchmark of WHO guideline, people could live more than 4 years longer. So I think it'll be really nice to hear from Azjargal and Enkhuun how they're thinking about, this target in general in the context of cleaner action. And, does this seem like a reasonable target and all the efforts that are happening in Mongolia to hit at least Mongolia's national standard? And in the context of these 3 key takeaways, which is just summarizing, air pollution is shortening lives across Mongolia. Air pollution is the greatest external health threat to life expectancy in Mongolia. And in Ulaanbaatar in particular, air quality levels are still much higher, not just than the WHO guideline, but even the country's own national standard. So it is in the context of these many problems that we're trying to understand how citizen community-led efforts are catalyzing cleaner action in Mongolia. And of course, we have these really inspiring women from Breathe Mongolia to help us walk through this. A quick introduction, we have Azza, who is the founder of Breathe Mongolia and currently the chair of the board. And we have Enkhuun, who is the founder and director of operations at Breathe Mongolia, my very good friends, both of them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now and hand it over to Enkhuun to first give us, a brief background of what Breathe Mongolia does, and then we will jump right into, a nicely curated conversation that we have for all of you. For the attendees, please use the Q&A box to add your questions. We'd love to hear from you. This is as much a space for you to ask questions to Azza and Enkhuun and, to us if you want to. So please use the Q&A box actively. Over to you, Enkhuun.
Thank you so much, Tanushree. I think that was a really good context setting. I just want to provide a bit more context into why we have an air pollution crisis and what we've been doing over the past 5-6 years to try to tackle it from an intersectional angle, and also covering sort of community mobilization to policy advocacy to using data to do that policy advocacy and mobilization. It's really interesting that you actually mentioned the air quality standards, because just last year, our air quality standards were updated and reinstated, and they were updated for at least the particulate matter to be at the WHO interim target level 3, so target 3. But what's really interesting is that actually the sulfur dioxide targets haven't been updated until since 2016, and actually between pre-2016 standards and post-2016 standards, the standards for SO2 are higher. So I think we have a bit of an interesting tour story to tell later why that is. So just to get into first the Mongolian context, this is data from 2020 at the national level. Obviously, the percentages and sources differ a bit city by city. The data availability also differs by city by city. But this is the latest data that we have from the National Statistical Office. So more than a majority of the pollution in Mongolia comes from household use of coal for heating and cooking. And that is because over 50% of households in Mongolia live in informal Gir districts or informal settlement areas where people don't have access to central heating and don't have access to sanitation systems. And we have very notoriously cold winters in Mongolia. We just got out of a cold snap. So 2 weeks ago, we were at negative 38 degrees at night. Now we're averaging about negative 15 to negative 20 degrees. And in these very cold temperatures, when people don't have access to central heating, people rely on the cheapest source of heating or fuel, which is coal. And the reason why we don't have central heating in so much of these areas is because of a rapid rates of rural to urban migration, which has been happening since the 1990s, but has really accelerated in the last 20 years. And a lot of that is fueled by climate change. So a lot of the urbanization is fueled by climate-induced sort of disasters or climate-induced losses of livelihoods. People settle in cities as a form of an adaptation mechanism, and that contributes to the pollution. Of course, the central heating that we do have, most of that comes from coal-fired power plants. So we're also very much so dependent on coal and fossil fuels in that area. And that makes up nationally about 10 to 20%, and then vehicular and transportation-related pollution, another 10 to 20%. So what that looks like in the day-to-day is this. So this was a photo that we took just before the end of 2025 in December. We went to some of the most polluted parts of the city and took pictures. And what you can really see here is the layering. And so the capital city is surrounded by mountains on all four sides. And so we really see how that pollution layer gets trapped. And this is pretty much where everybody lives. And if you can see, Atta and I, our background is actually, it shows the mountainous region and the informal districts from overhead. So as an organization, we started formally in 2019 to 2020. And we really started because there was no strong civil society voice that was speaking up for air pollution and clean air from an advocacy perspective. And while we started from an air pollution perspective, we've over the past couple of years, we've become more and more explicit about the need to act at the intersection of climate and air quality. And so now really strategically positioned to move on working both on climate change and air pollution and how can we tackle these issues with the intersections that they require. Our mission is to transform policies and narratives, connect and educate communities, and advance collaborative solutions for clean air to protect global climate and to champion environmental justice. And for us, this transforming policies and narratives is very important because we think that policies are not the only problem. Actually, it's the narrative that we use to talk about the issue and the narrative that we use to talk about the solutions, that's the real problem and where the real change needs to happen. Because so much of the narrative about air pollution has been about blaming households that burn coal as a form of heating as polluters. And we think that this really masks the more systemic and deeper causes that are driving this crisis, which include climate crisis, which include energy insecurity, which is very much so tied to geopolitics and to other sort of socioeconomic developmental conversations nationally and regionally and internationally. We're a team, our full-time team is based in Mongolia, but we have volunteers and other staff across the world in about 15 different countries. We have volunteers, interns, advisors who are working with us. And we're a registered nonprofit in the US. So we have double registration. What we do fits around 4 different three to four different boxes. First is education and capacity building. So how can we arm people with the resources that they need in order to be able to protect their health and in order to be able to participate in advocacy and mobilization? The second is building community and coalition. So how do we make sure that the people who are working in this sector are working together, sharing information? And how can civil society become more coordinated to have a stronger advocacy voice? The third thing that we do is we act as a watchdog and conduct policy advocacy activities, ranging anywhere from petitions to meetings to putting out policy briefs and reports to analyzing policies to even conducting protests. And the fourth thing that we're starting to do now is that narrative change work. So how do we actually become part of the evidence creation, which is where the air quality data really comes into play? This is just a brief summary of some of the capacity building activities that we've done over the past year. Here, I think I'll talk about some of the advocacy activities in the questions, so I'll briefly skip over this. And what I really wanted to focus on here is one of the research that we're doing right now is to understand how can we view air pollution from an environmental justice angle in Mongolia, and how are people's everyday experiences of air pollution as an environmental injustice issue, how does that compare to how our legal and policy system addresses air pollution? And does our legal and policy system imbue environmental justice principles? And if not, how can you bridge that gap? So that's part of some of the narrative change work that we're doing. And yeah, I'm really excited to get into the conversation.
Thank you, Enkhuun. I think that was a fantastic sort of layout for the conversation that we're going to have. Of course, I had put in some questions earlier, which I had shared with Enkhuun and Azza, but I don't think I'm going to ask those anymore because of all the content that you've now given me, Enkhuun. So jumping right into it, we'll let Enkhuun catch a breath. But it's my first question to you, and we'll come to the media questions in a bit. But something that Enkhuun said made me think. So she said that when Breathe Mongolia was founded, you were one of the very few organizations who were working in the air pollution space in Mongolia. So I just wanted to understand, what do you think the reason was? I'm assuming that there wasn't enough data or information available. But sort of, could you give me a little more context in terms of, what was the kind of information that was available back then, and why did you think that you need something like a Breathe Mongolia to sort of elevate air pollution as an issue on the agenda, or sort of to begin a conversation with people about air pollution? So just some reflections from that.
Yeah, we definitely weren't the only organization. There were some other nonprofits made up from mostly activist parents as well, and then also some other organizations led by scientists and researchers, field experts. Um, at the time, I was living in New York City, and even though I grew up experiencing the pollution, especially in Ulaanbaatar as a college student, I had no idea about the health impact. I would just like wipe my nose and ears of the soot or dust the soot off my furniture and UV and just live my life. I had no idea how bad it was until my family started getting sick. My dad got diagnosed with cancer, and in the year of late 2017, my family members, my even sister-in-law, who was pregnant at the time, she got pneumonia and hospitalized. So that's when I really started looking into what's happening over there and started researching. And when I wanted to understand the issue from no non-scientific background, just as a concerned citizen, I needed to understand the bigger picture, like why is happening, what was done, what didn't work, what worked, why are we not solving this? Who is in charge and what needs to happen, what are the gaps? And that brought us to air quality data as well, because we can only measure progress, or we can see how bad the air quality is through the data, right? So when we got started, we mainly had access to reference grade stations from the government. It was on a a website called agar.mn and on a mobile app called O2. And it had air quality data only of Ulaanbaatar city, the capital city. And then when I researched more, there was another not popular, really not the best UX design website by the ministry that had also air quality data from the provinces. But there was no one central place where all the air quality data from the entire nation was sitting. And at that time, that we would use the air quality index to understand how bad it was, but they were labeled as high pollution, moderate pollution, low pollution. There was no information about the health impact, like unhealthy or hazardous level. So I had to do some extra work and learn from others, learn from other scientists, and learn from the protesters that have gone before me to understand the health impact and connect the dots. And there was an opportunity for nonprofits to set up a low-cost sensor monitoring network. And we took that opportunity and we needed to get funds because when we first started as a movement, I had to buy low-cost sensors out of pocket to challenge the government's declaration that in 2018 pollution level decreased by 50%. But nothing had really changed at the time. There was no policy change. There was no specific action taken to reduce pollution, but suddenly there was a declaration that pollution decreased. So I paid out of pocket and worked with investigative journalists, and they started checking the air quality right next to the reference grade stations over a month. And then we started investigating why that claim was announced, and we realized that the air quality index formula changed. And that's why the numbers look better. So we realized the importance of independent monitoring, watchdog activities, and having our own set of monitors or having monitors that we have access to that we can verify as well. So we collaborated with another nonprofit and received some grant to build the air quality map. And when we were building it, I wanted to make sure that we weren't just telling how bad the air quality was, but we wanted to tell what the health impact was and what actions people should take with that information. Because it's not just enough to know, oh, today is hazardous, and then what? You need to close your windows, you need to wear your masks, use air purifiers, and do all these different actions. So I saw the need to mobilize people while we're also educating them.
No, I think the specific point about something that struck me based on what you were saying, Adza, and just a bit of a follow up. When you started your journey in the air pollution space and in your bid to understand, what is happening with air pollution, do you feel that there is absence of language around air pollution which resonates at more with the general public at a more visceral level? And do you think with the work that you've been doing now, there is more language available for people to engage? And it'll be nice if you could also give us and our attendees a sense of what that language looks like, because I'm just seeing a question coming in, which is that there is data, but uh, how do people really engage with it, right? Because something like an AQI is not very intuitive for a person who's not engaged with air pollution as an issue. So just some sort of thoughts around that, like the absence of language when you started, and is there more language now, and what does that look like?
At the time, I don't think there was too much language. Even on the state website, like I mentioned, they just stated the level of pollution and explained like this is bad and bad. but one of our advisors had to give recommendation to the decision makers to also
Mm,
like add some health impact information too. So now, even though it's not labeled as like unhealthy and hazardous, it still has like high pollution. The explanation on the website has that, oh, people who are sensitive, elderly, watch out and take care of your health or monitor your health and stuff like that. But I'd still think there needs to be more done. At this time, compared to, years ago, people are definitely more aware of the health impact and they know it's bad for them, but a lot of them still think that it's only a respiratory issue. They still don't understand that it can cause havoc in your entire body system or even cardiovascular issues. So our challenge is that many who are more educated on the issue, they're wearing masks, they're closing their windows, they're buying air purifiers. They want to protect their children. They want to know, like, if their air quality is good, whether they should open the window or take their baby out for a walk. They want to change their behavior and they are adapting to it, but still there's a lot more work to be done because it's such an integral part of our winter now. You know, it's an everyday thing. And so many people sometimes are just very resigned and hopeless as well. So they don't want to even
mm,
look at it and think about it. And some are very vigilant, especially young parents or, people who are more aware of it, but some they just don't want to know. So yes, the language is still there, but there needs to be a lot more conversation. It needs to be like we did so well during COVID that there was like
mm,
constant messages from our government, like wear your mask, social distancing, wash your hands. And people did wear masks, indoors and outdoors, like quite a bit, but we dropped it. And I wish we
mm.
continued that vigilance and, consistent motivation and incentive to protect health of our public as well. Sometimes I even see some of my team members not wear masks. Like, hey, what are you doing?
Think one point again, taking from you, Edza, and sort of maybe I'll bring in Enkhuun into the conversation. This is a recurring theme across countries, right? When there is a repeated air pollution episode, pessimism and just that cynicism is bound to kick in, where people, start thinking that, nothing's happening and, we don't need to worry about it anymore. We can't be wearing masks all the time. So in that background, can you talk us can you talk us through some of your efforts towards sustaining conversation around the issue of air pollution? Because I think when it becomes very evident, people are definitely very curious and the interest in the issue is peaked. But I think the challenge is also sustaining that conversation. So if you can talk us through a little bit about your efforts on sustaining the conversation around the year.
No, that's a very important question, especially because air pollution tends to be quite seasonal with temperatures, the cold temperatures. I think just picking back off of the narrative aspect and then trying to link that to how do we maintain the conversation when it feels like when people don't have the scientific and maybe technical language to talk about air quality, we turn to our senses and more qualitative sort of narratives and stories. So some of the stories that we hear quite often is stories about the color of the smoke. And this was something that we heard a lot about this past winter because the government started distributing a new type of fuel, a new type of coal for households to use. And people were talking about how the color is when the coal is burning, it's like a brighter red. And then when the smoke is coming out, it's a bit of a different foul smell. Or, for households that live a bit higher up in the mountains, they can see the general layout of the pollution, like in the picture that I showed. And they were talking about how it used to be more of a black, dark smoke, and now it's a bit grayer. And so I think even these like narrative tellings of air quality is something that we try to document, because when we don't have access to the quantitative data to say this is why the colors are changing, this is why the smell is changing. Something that we can at least do is to keep document the stories of what people are smelling, what people are feeling. Some of the stories that we've heard from young people is we had somebody who participated in our youth fellowship program who told us that up until they were 16, they didn't know what a winter with clean air was like. And they were only able to find out because they went out of the city when they were 16 for winter, and they were coming back into the city and driving, and they saw the pollution. And so now we have an entire generation of young people who don't even know what clean air winter looks like. And I think for a lot of those young people, it's very hard to imagine what winter and clean air would be like. So how do we maintain that attention is something that we ask a lot about. How do we maintain the attention of decision makers throughout the entire year? And also how do we maintain the attention of the public throughout the entire year? With decision makers, honestly, both are, I think, are quite difficult. I think with decision makers, pollution becomes priority a lot with election cycles. And so now something that we're starting more of a conversation is how do we link the air quality issue with the energy security issue? How do we link it with the just transition issue? How do we link it with the topics that they're already talking about? How do we link it with the health issue? How do we link it with the topics that they're already talking about and care about, and that's important for them politically? And of course, because air pollution is so intersectional, it's connected to all of those issues. So using some of that framing to make it more of a priority for them. And then for the public, I think, if every single day the news is telling you that the air quality is bad, it's like every single day the news is telling you that it's going to rain. And at some point, you just stop watching the news. And I think for some people, they start to actively avoid the news or start to actively avoid thinking about pollution because it's such a source of stress. And so then for that, it's how do we balance the solutions and the action-oriented approach with telling people about the negative health impacts. And I think that's a formula that we're still honestly trying out, trying to figure out, and something that we hope some of our qualitative interview and research work will reveal about how do we do that sort of communication intervention more effectively.
I know that you're still thinking about it, but sort of, are you able to give an example of what this looks like? Like, how do you balance the negative message and the optimistic message, so to say, which is the solutions-oriented message? Do you have like a specific example?
I think people are, because the air pollution issue is so tied to sort of household energy security. I think what works is when we show sort of examples that have worked in terms of energy transitions. So households have transitioned from using coal as a source of heating to electric or to renewables, and to using those stories to say there is another option, and this is something that can work at a more on a more systems level, on a more societal level, not just in a couple of households.
Other things that we've been doing is that digitally on social media, on our educational outreach efforts, even on our air quality map, when people click on the pin, a window pops up and it's like, this is hazardous, insulate your room, close your window, don't go outside, or don't smoke if it's like indoor air quality sensor. So we are giving them at least 3 things to do. When we make a social media post about different pollution sources or anything educational, we always end with call to actions like swap your cleaning product, or, this is how you choose your air purifier. This is why you should change the filters in your car, or this is why vaping is bad, And these are the things that you can do individually to reduce your own emissions, protect your own health, and also these are the things that you need to do to demand in terms of policy implementation, or sign this petition, or go to this hearing. You know, one example that we will mention during this webinar will be the public petition on air pollution as well, public hearing. So we want to do more of that. We've created quite a bit of comprehensive resources for people on specific individual actions, very detailed practical steps people can take, just a comprehensive resource that people can turn to. But now it's a matter of like marketing them, making it more digestible, bite-sized, and working with more professional marketers and campaigners to spread the word and constantly keep that in mind. Because as Enkhuun said, just because it's seasonal, that doesn't mean there is no pollution in the summer and warmer days. We still have pollution from vehicles. When I'm in Mongolia, walking down the street in the summer, I simply cannot breathe next to the traffic. I need to wear like a gas mask. But I see small children sleeping in cars with the windows open. So we
Right.
still have a lot of work to do to educate people and turn their attention to different sources of pollution and different things they can do during every season of the year.
Right. So I think largely our conversation has been around sort of, getting the public engaged. Of course, Enkhuun talked a little bit about, how do you sort of tie the air pollution narrative into issues that the political class or the policymakers are already talking about. And Asa, something that you said earlier, right? That initially the way the government was displaying air quality was only through the AQI levels. But then, some of your advocacy led to then these health impacts also becoming explicit with the AQI levels. So my question for you, Asa, is that how do you make something like that happen, right? Because it's not an easy task for the government to come out and say that the pollution level is bad and these are the kind of impacts. So while you can put out the levels, but contextualizing it in the actual impacts that those levels can have is probably not a very easy change to happen. So what were the efforts that led to something like that happening? Because that seems like a very tangible outcome of the efforts that you guys had earlier on. So can you talk us through a little bit about what went into making that happen? So creating a more holistic health advisory around AQI levels and their impacts on people's lives.
It was mainly our advisor. She is very well connected and she's been advising different decision makers and experts privately as well. And she's one of the people who've started the public protest and advised the people who organized the protest. So she's the one who gave advice to the people who are in charge of the AQI index. So that was a win for us. It wasn't that particular win was not something that we had to mobilize the entire public and rally them up and bring it to their attention. Yeah, that was the case for that
I see.
little slight change. Yeah.
But then the message there also is that you need to find a champion who's able to sort of bat for you to make a change happen, right? So I'm also thinking it in terms of lessons that can be replicated across other places. So that does seem like a lesson, right? Having a champion who's able to, bat for a particular outcome that you want. But sort of now going back to, the work that you guys do around one, of course, that community building exercise, but also this policy, the role that you play for policy watchdog. I think that's very interesting, particularly when you're trying to engage people into more media conversations around a policy change that's happening. How can people voice their opinion, or a public hearing that's happening, and so on. So can you maybe talk us, and both of you actually, Asa and Enkhuun, Asa first, if you can talk us through a little bit about what's your thinking around that sort of policy watchdog aspect, right? How important is it for people to engage on some of these issues, and what are more realistic or tangible ways in which they can actually participate in some of these governance issues? That's sort of the larger question that I had.
You can get started, Enkhuun.
Sure. I think one, and this is coming also back from the public communication and messaging, I think sometimes we tend to underestimate how much the public can understand nuance. Of course, communication that is accessible, of course, bite-sized, but also transparently show the nuance. Because I think if we don't show the nuance, that's where trust is lost. And I think one of the examples is back in 2019, following these sort of larger protests in which the advisor that Adja was mentioning was a part of, there was a coal ban on the use of raw coal for household heating. And the government introduced coal briquettes as sort of the alternative option, but there was no really choice. It was the only option. So raw coal was banned, and then this new type of coal was introduced. And then after the coal briquettes were introduced, there are quite a number of reports and papers that show that PM 2.5 levels have decreased comparing 2019 and post 2019 levels, anywhere from 30, and then some reports say up to 60%. Now, it's very difficult to gauge the accuracy of these because the range is so big, and also a lot of these are coming out from either state-sponsored reports or state-sponsored projects. But there's also qualitative evidence of people talking about how the sort of look and feel of pollution has changed. But what that sort of data masks is that sulfur dioxide levels doubled in that same period, that PM 2.5 decreased. And that's because of the consistency of the coal, the difference in the consistency of the coal. And now when we bury that nuance by saying that pollution decreased by X% because of the coal briquettes, we have people who are saying, no, but I can still smell it. It still feels just as hazardous, but the government is telling me that it's decreased by this much. And so when we don't have that sort of nuance that we communicate, I think that loses that public trust. So I think one of the first things that we do is how do we communicate nuance, and how do we give the full transparent stock of information without getting people too overwhelmed. And then I am completely forgetting your question, but I think it was back to around how do we get people involved into advocacy and into more of the mobilization aspect. I think forming that trust-based relationship is really, really important because especially last year, there were a group of civil society organizations and advocates and scientists that we coordinated together to release a petition that called for a public hearing on air pollution policies and why air pollution policies weren't working. And that petition garnered 70,000 signatures in a matter of 10 days. And the parliament hosted a public hearing, and there was a resolution that came out afterwards with one of the promises being to gradually cease subsidizing coal from the state budget, which was really big for us. The one really big thing that we learned, both in terms of coordinating civil society and also trying to get the public engaged, is really the mistrust even between civil society organizations with each other. And that comes from a long history of civil society organizations working in various ways, and maybe some civil society organizations, having political interests. And so it was our responsibility to kind of rebuild that trust-based relationship between the people who are coordinating that advocacy, and then to also form that trust with the public, to tell them the full set of transparent information and to say, this is the current state of play and this is what you can tangibly do. I think what we really could have done a better job of is including an even broader set of civil society organizations working from different sectors around the issue. So even civil society organizations working from the education sector, because there are a lot of kindergartens and schools that have very bad air quality issues. And so how do we bring all of these different sectoral partners in and form alliances that might seem unlikely, but to have this common goal? And then Adja, maybe you have more insights.
Oh, thank you, Enkhuun. I just want to plug in our recently launched policy tracker. It's been our dream to launch it. Finally, we got to it. So it's basically a one-stop shop a central hub for all the policy documents, legislations, different resolutions, reports that have to do with climate change and air pollution in Mongolia. So we started that database, and people can filter by the year, topic, or whether it's like a resolution or legislation or mandate, by the type of document in both English and Mongolian. And we're slowly adding more and more documents on there because we learned that when we wanted to organize that public hearing on many of the parliament members, they were brand new. They had no institutional knowledge and memory, and they had to have a crash course on pollution. And we needed to provide them with all the different resources, the research papers, and just as much as they can absorb. And there was no one place that they could just access it. So we built that all last year and we published it. It was one of our dreams. And we also built this comprehensive health impact page as well. We translated it into Mongolian because there's an institution in Switzerland, they've already done it, but we added Mongolian context to it as well. So we just want to accumulate all the resources in one place, all the useful information for decision makers and even for the public for transparency so that people can just, you know, absorb everything in one place and quickly make decisions, quickly make progress instead of like wasting time trying to understand the issue and trying to research from different sources. So that knowledge management is really important as well.
Right. We are now beginning to get a bunch of questions from the attendees, which means that our conversation is going in the right direction, which is great. But I'd like to pick on one question, and this kind of goes back to one of the earlier slides that I presented, which was around just the target setting, right? They have this really interesting question about there's the geography of Ulaanbaatar, which is a little tricky, and is also playing a role in worsening air pollution in the region. So the question I think is that to what extent can pollution be eliminated in Ulaanbaatar, right? Like if we were to think of a realistic target for pollution levels in the region, given its geography and sort of source composition and so on. And would like reflections from both of you. What do you think is a realistic target? And also based on your conversations with, the larger alliances that you have with the scientific community and so on.
I don't think there's any research that's been conducted about sort of reduction potential or like a complete reduction potential. I think there are some scenario-based analyses of how interventions could impact air quality levels, but even that for us is quite limited. And of course, we don't like to respond with we need more data and we need more reports, but honestly, we need more data, we need more evidence, and we need more reports. And one of the things that we're really pushing for is a more comprehensive approach, because this is an issue that involves so many different ministries, so many different industries, so many different government agencies, that we need that type of coordination. And if the energy ministry is doing something completely different to what the environment ministry is doing, then the likelihood of a result is not that great. So one thing that we're pushing is how can we sort of have a more comprehensive emissions reduction, pollution reduction potential study that looks at all the different types of sort of sources and emissions, all the different types of transition options, and then really calculates from an economic perspective, from a health perspective, from an air quality perspective, and from a cost perspective, what we need to do. So I think that's a question that we still need to answer, but I hope that the answer is until we have clean air.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to blow up the mountains to clear the valley. And even if we didn't have a valley, that pollutes that traps the pollution. We don't want to emit black carbon that melts the Arctic. eyes. So to protect the global health, we definitely want to reduce it as much as possible, as soon as possible. And we need to attack the sources of emission, right? The inversion in the valley, it's just the factor that contributes to it, but it's not the source. So we need to be focused on the sources and implement policies that reduce the sources and regulate the sources and
I
measure
think
our progress with the data.
I think that's a very, very solid answer, because I think that this is also I think it's a very practical takeaway for people who've tuned into the webinar, that maybe the next step now in sort of efforts towards addressing air pollution in Mongolia is to have a study like that, which tells you, sectorally, what is the reduction pathway and where could that potentially take pollution levels in Ulaanbaatar and Mongolia at large. So I think that's a very solid suggestion. And folks who've tuned in, who are interested in doing more air pollution work, this seems like something that you can pick up. We have another very interesting question, and this sort of goes back to the discussion that we were having around trust, right? So I'll read out the question as is, because it's a beautifully written question, which is, when pollution data is publicly available, how do we ensure that communities and policymakers can distinguish between credible science-based findings and misinformation or misinterpretation? What strategies can help us build trust in the data so that it drives real action rather than confusion? And sort of this also comes back to the point that, Edza, you were making, right? Different platforms, sort of the data is scattered everywhere. Different platforms have different data. So confusion is bound to happen, right? So how do we cut through that? Any practical recommendations around that?
They, we don't have too many sources of data right now. We have reference grade stations from the government that are super expensive. And hold on. Okay. So they are, maintained by professional agencies. So they need to be making sure that enough sufficient funds are allocated to calibrate, to maintain and repair those stations and sensors and the technology, right? And as watchdog organization or the public or civic society, we want to make sure that they're doing that job. So that's one way to trust the data, because I've noticed some government stations, even though they are capable of sensing, 4, 5, 6 criteria pollutants, only like 1 or 2 of them are working. And the air quality index is showing good air quality, but it's missing the main pollutant in that area, sulfur dioxide or particulate matter. So that's why when nothing changed. So that's why we need to really make sure that those stations are working properly, maintained and fixed, and sufficient funds are allocated, and demanding that accountability from the government. And then if there are low-cost sensors deployed by different organizations, civil society, or even, individuals, we definitely need to coordinate them and calibrate the data as much as possible and help them repair the low-cost sensors and help them maintain them as well, because there's not enough capacity or knowledge among those low-cost sensor owners as well to know that, to know how to fix their monitors as well, and even like co-located, So we need to organize those different workshops and collaborate with government and private sectors and individuals, and so that the data is calibrated as much as possible, and that we can work together, so that low-cost sensors can fill in the gaps missed by the reference grade, and that we can both trust that data. Because I want to also remind people that when we talk about air pollution in Mongolia, it's not just UB, countrysides, province centers, their pollution can be even higher than UB at some points. So we always want to make sure it's a national problem. It's an urban center problem. Wherever there is an urban center that is burning something, there is an air pollution problem.
Just quickly, I think this is actually a concern that comes up a lot from the government of Mongolia, which is that, if we give this data to you, then what if you misrepresented? And what if your findings are different from us? And so what will the public think? And that's one of the justifications that the government uses to put a paywall on the data. But I think the response to that is actually more transparency and more open data principles rather than less transparency and more restrictions. But I think as the more transparent you become, the more responsibility the data producers and the curators of that data hold. Because then you have the responsibility of ensuring that whoever uses that data is doing it. So I think is doing it, with the intention of using it for an evidence-based perspective and not to confuse the public. And I think some of the things that we can do is ask questions like, who are these sensors owned by? Who is the data owned by? Who funds the data? And to put that up transparently to the public, to say, this is where this data was sourced, this is how the analysis was conducted. And then I think we get into larger conversations about generally how do we prevent mis and disinformation in especially the digital communication space. And I think that's a larger communication and media conversation.
I think those are really useful suggestions. So I think the person who asked the question, I'm assuming they have a satisfactory answer. We are pretty much on time, and I want to leave like a minute or two to just wrap up the conversation. I've been taking notes aggressively, but I don't know if I'll be able to capture the breadth of the conversation that we've had. But I have one last question, and this is going to be a rapid fire. Again, this question is from someone from the attendees. So the question is, what are few things you would ask decision makers to do ahead of next winter? So I'll make it a rapid fire one for both of you. So 2 things, Edza, and 2 things, Enkhuun.
Insulate, make our homes energy efficient, and invest in our grid infrastructure, make it available and accessible and affordable, especially for the underserved communities.
Okay.
Second all of that, and then plus, don't just think about before next winter, think about the next 5 to 10 years. Don't just think about your election cycle.
Perfect. That was more rapid fire than the kind of rapid fire that I intended it to be. But thank you, Edza and Enkhuun. I think this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'm going to do a really terrible job at summarizing some of the things that I've heard from you guys, just trying to sort of pack the different themes that I've heard. I think one thing which is very important and also sort of a key takeaway for everyone who's joined the webinar today is organizing information is very important. I think the more we scatter information, I think we make it more prohibitive for people to engage with the information. So organizing information, I think, is very important. Maybe it could be a platform like the one Breathe Mongolia has, or maybe it could be something else that people think of, creating in their countries. So I think organizing information is very important. The second thing which really stood out to me was, how do we balance nuance, being candid about the negative impacts, and also sort of talking through the solutions-oriented messaging. So how does all of that feature into communication? So in my head, I've always thought of communication as something that has to be personal, emotional, and relevant. But I think now there are these added layers that are coming in, which is nuance, being honest about the negative impacts, but then also sort of being optimistic about solutions where the solutions could take us. The third thing around sort of identifying champions earlier on who can then help you sort of push through your work and get you the kind of outcomes is important. Fourth, building trust within the civil society, I think, is also becoming an important issue, especially when you want to forge alliances to push agenda forward. So how do you go about building the trust? And then finally, the whole sort of conversation around, instead of shutting information, it's better to be more transparent. so that you can start a dialogue, and then you can, if there are errors or mistakes anywhere, those can be caught. So rather than shutting down, transparency and open data is the way to be. So those are the 5 sort of things that I took from the conversation. And then 6th additional bonus item that I think was really useful was this additional research, which could actually turbocharge some of the conversations around sectoral transition pathways in Mongolia, around a study which maybe helps Mongolia set a target for air pollution reduction. But thank you so much once again, Enkhuun and Asa. I'm seeing lovely comments for you in the comment box. I think everyone who's joined us today has really learned a lot from you guys. So thank you so much for giving us your time. And to everyone else who joined us today, hope to see you on the next Data to Action webinar. And if you have any recommendations on who we should host next, please drop us a line and we will make that happen. But thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day ahead.
Thank you.